friends, welcome to Behind the Returns. This is your host Arun and I head the mutual fund research at Funds India. As always, we have a super interesting guest with us today. We have Mr. Nimesh Chandan, head equities investments in Canara Robeco Mutual Fund. Hi Nimesh, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi Arun, it's a pleasure to join in this conversation. I wish everyone good, healthy, and safe time during this pandemic, and hope we get over this soon. Looking forward to this conversation.
Sure. So before we start, I just want to share something which is super interesting about Nimesh. Nimesh is a huge behavioral finance enthusiast, and he's also an amazing writer. So he writes a lot of fantastic articles under the series called The Stoic Investor. So more than me explaining, I'll probably Nimesh, you can take a few minutes to take our readers through what really goes behind each and every one of your articles into the Stoic Investor, and what was the broad thought process behind this whole series?
Thank you for the kind words, Arun. I've been interested in behavioral finance for last, I think, 15 to 16 years, and I took a course with Hersh Shefrin in Amsterdam Institute of Finance on specifically this topic. And the more I study the markets, the more I study the track records built by very good investors across the world, I find that there is a one common link between all of this is temperament. So while you can have fantastic knowledge about the markets and how they move, how the fundamentals move, how the economies move, how the businesses move, but information edge only gets you that far. To actually be very successful in the investing business, you need to have a good temperament, or what we call as a behavioral edge. So this series of the Stoic Investor actually focuses more on markets as a crowd and how individuals behave, and what are the biases that creep into the investment decision making process. And every article, while it highlights a certain bias and what people should be doing and what people are doing, it also gives certain ideas and tips at the end about how to handle these biases and how to probably take advantage of crowd biases to improve your decision making. And I think it only takes a little bit better decision making compared to the others to really generate good performance compared to the benchmark or compared to the market averages.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nimesh. So, because that now that you've told that you're a major behavioral finance enthusiast, Nimesh, from whatever we have been studying behavioral finance for the past few years, so what we've realized is that behavioral finance does an amazing job in terms of telling us, saying, "Hey, you guys have so and so issues in terms of your thinking. So these are the biases which normally get into our way, and hence your decision making most likely goes for a toss under so and so scenarios, and one bias after the other keeps getting added. So all that is great, right? But probably one of the next logical question where it is still work in progress for behavioral finance is, how do we address these issues? Okay, all these issues are there, well and good, fine, accepted. So how do we sort this out? Now, because you're in a sweet spot where you read the theory and you've also implemented a lot of this in Can Robeco's investment process. So wanted to hear from you as to how do we actually solve for this, and how do you actually bring the theory and implement it in the day-to-day investment process in Can Robeco Mutual Fund?
So yes, that's a very interesting question. And many of us, I think, who started on this behavioral finance journey were initially told that you can identify things and you'll know when you can go wrong, but you won't be able to do anything about it. My experience has been actually very different, and maybe because my expectations were very different. First, I would say, as identifying biases, I think that's first and a very important step in actually rebiasing or eliminating those biases. Once you identify a bias, when you are conscious that suppose as a value investor, you're doing something that you get you into a value trap, for example, once you're conscious about it, you have avoided quite a few potholes on the road anyway. Number two, behavioral finance actually came up as something opposite to the efficient market hypothesis. The proponents of efficient market hypothesis went to such mathematical precision to define how markets move or how stocks should be moving. They actually lost track of what's really happening in the market, what happens in practice. Behavioral finance says that you can't put human beings as rational and expect uh, the economics and finance to move like natural sciences, like physics. So there's something called a physics envy that economics has. We try to make it so precise that natural laws should be the same, as what we do in economics. But it doesn't work that way. It's because behavioral finance approaches from a human angle, saying that people do overreact, people do have biases. It doesn't give you a mathematical answer as to a precise answer that this is what you should be doing, this is the formula you should be holding. But it gives you hints about what you can identify and improve on. So I think expectations have to be set in a way that behavioral finance will tell you through a lot of studies that what can go wrong, and then you build customized solutions to your biases or to how your strategy and how you take advantage of those things. The third part, what we have implemented at Canara Robeco, we started implementing certain behavioral tools, steps, and processes in our investment process from 2014 onwards. And they are broadly classified into two buckets. One, where we need to identify where the crowd has overreacted or underreacted and see what we can benefit from there, what we can take advantage of. And two, the bucket where we identify what are personal biases or team biases that can come into our decision making and how to identify and avoid them as much as possible. Now, in the first bucket, we have certain tools which identify overreaction. This is based on one of the screeners we run, a behavioral screener based on the study done by Richard Thaler and DeBond. This paper was published in 1986, which said that over a period of time, underperformers and outperformers, they actually changed roles. They did a study for 3 years and 5 years. They found that the loser portfolio stocks that have underperformed in the subsequent 3 and 5 years started outperforming the winner portfolio, which had the outperformers. We tested it for the Indian market and we found the statistics and the results to be quite significant. And we started using this, and it works as our contrarian stock picker, the screener. And two, there are also underreaction studies. For example, you see earnings drift that comes in once a company gives a surprise in earnings, whether negative or positive. There is a post-earnings announcement drift because people are anchored to their previous expectation. They change slowly, so that leads to underreaction in stock prices. So again, we try to identify where we can get advantage of this underreaction or momentum that is just building up. In personal biases, we use a lot of tools. We try to do a bull bear case analysis, a pre-mortem, to see to it that when analysts are presenting their ideas, they don't get attached to that idea in terms of just looking at confirmation bias or rejecting any counter arguments like a cognitive dissonance. It's better they themselves track and analyze what can be a negative scenario, what can be a positive scenario, and build the cases accordingly. That way, they are not hooked on to just one price and recommendation. They are flexible enough to incorporate new information as it comes and change whenever it's required. During the conversation, I can highlight some of the other tools also that we use in decision making to improve our outcomes.
Sure. So, Nimesh, can you just give us some examples of how these three buckets of indicators helped you in real time? So let's say the contrarian bucket of indicators, how did they help you in identifying, let's say, any particular bunch of stocks or bunch of or a particular theme in the past? Are there any real life examples where probably we can understand a little more on how these things actually work?
Sure. So I'll just give you examples of important contra bets that we took in the last 3 years. So in 2018, the beginning of 2018, uh, the uh, our screener started showing certain private banks, private corporate facing banks, in as a contrarian bet. They were underperformers for 3 years and 5 years because RBI had asked them to do a cleanup of their balance sheets. Their historical NPAs had to be provided for aggressively. You will remember in 2015, RBI came out with a timeline to provide for all these restructured assets. So between 2015 and 18, the banks were going through this cleanup. The numbers were not looking good at that time. These were underperformers at that time, and it came up that this is something area to watch out for, whether as a basket they can turn around. Uh, the screener gives us ideas, and we actually run them through our fundamental investment process. And some of these banks actually qualified for that because we could clearly see an end of a tough period for these private corporate banks, and we were able to invest in them during between I think March and June of 2018. And then you've seen the kind of run. We were able to get the timing also right. Generally, these calls work over 3 to 5 year period, but we were lucky to see it giving returns immediately. In 2019, a large part of this generic pharma pack came into this list as underperformers, which the screener suggested as having some potential to do better. And we looked at them. We found that while pharma is a bottom-up sector, people were just trashing these companies, giving them low valuations on a top-down negative view. So we were able to identify certain domestic companies, certain CRAMS companies, which had a trend of business very different from the overall generic space. And even some of the generics where they were at the resolution of their historical problems. We were able to invest in some of the pharma companies very well. They were doing well for us, and during COVID, they did even better. So at the beginning of 2020, you would remember when people were moving into defensive companies, and especially the pharma sector, we benefited from that. And recently, and I would say even in 2015-16, we had commodity companies coming up in our screeners, which showed that they have a potential of a turnaround. People were misreading the cycles that typically happens in commodities. And hence we saw them coming in our overreaction to the downside screener, as well as underreaction, our starting move on an upward journey also. So these screeners gave us these contrarian ideas. We also run, as I said, certain companies or screeners on positive surprises that come in. Certain chemical companies were coming into those screeners where people had underreacted to the positive run that these companies have had. On our own biases and the way we analyze companies, whether we made any mistakes or whether we did anything better. In the bull bear case scenario, for example, when COVID hit, we were able to switch quickly to what can be the bear case scenario in case of things going bad. We were able to exit certain businesses at the right time purely because the bear case scenario started showing up, and we were able to adjust to the prices there. It happened on company specific basis also. For example, again, I'll use a pharma example here, a company having a profit warning, or rather they're having a warning letter on their facility or import alert on their facility, how much it impacts, what kind of bear case scenario it opens up, and then we adjust accordingly our positions. So these help in a better way. I would think otherwise such stock picking or decisions would be difficult, because most of the people have this representativeness bias where a company that has not performed for a few years, people consider it to be a bad company. So the stock has not performed, but people label the company along with the stock as a bad company. And it takes a lot of time for people to actually review the results of those companies, and they misread the cycle many a times. So suggesting as coming from suggestions coming from an analyst like a screener that tells you that this is something that you should look at least review it fundamentally, see if it makes sense to you. I think that helps. So these are some of the tools that attack, as I said, confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, representativeness, overconfidence. These are addressed by these tools, and we are able to make better decisions compared to probably the average investor.
So, Nimesh, just curious. So, what are your contrarian screens pointing to at this juncture? Where is it directionally pointing to?
So as I said, recently, actually, we had PSUs and metal companies, commodity companies coming as leaders because they have like had a downturn for many, many years. And some of them, so it's not that just because the screener is telling us something, we would invest in them. We have certain criteria that we look at in terms of business, in terms of the management, in terms of the valuation. And we put everything in another tool called a checklist. So every data point that is important to us for decision making are covered in that checklist. We reject many of these companies based if they don't meet our fundamental criteria. But even if you get out of the 20, 30 companies that we screen or the ideas that are suggested, if we get 3 or 4 of them, it's a fantastic year generally for us.
Sure. The other question is in a lot of areas in life, the way we look at things is if the outcome is good, then the inherent assumption is that the underlying process must also be good. So just a simple case of, let's say I go to a restaurant and I go to my favorite restaurant, have a dosa. Irrespective of whenever I go, the dosa tastes the same, be it 5 years back or today. So the guy knows the recipe, he puts a process and that gets repeated. And this is probably this framework that all of us use for most of the areas in life. But however, when it comes to investing, it's a complete, the whole thing completely shifts where sometimes we have noticed that even the best of the best fund managers with long-term track records go through a long patch of underperformance. So there is the fact that the performance is not consistent, just like the other fields, gives us a significant issue in terms of how do we look at the underperformance. And the most important question is, why does this happen in investing? Why can't a particular investor or a particular fund manager always give consistent move? What is different in investing vis-a-vis all the other aspects of life?
So again, a brilliant question and a brilliant topic. The investors in the equity markets and in the financial markets in general have to deal with two aspects which are missing probably in other areas of business, whether you're in manufacturing or services or whether you are doing even gambling. So there are two aspects which are different. One is uncertainty. While other businesses or even gambling, people have to deal with risk. In equity markets, in financial markets, you have to deal with uncertainty. And the difference here, though they sound like synonyms, the difference is when you roll a dice, yes, you don't know what kind of number will turn up on the face, but you know that the range is from 1 to 6. In equity markets, there is no such range that you will get outcomes within a 1 and a 6. The numbers can be anything. It can go from -50 to maybe +200. So there is a huge range of outcomes that are possible. And that's why there is uncertainty. What we have to deal with then is where does majority of the outcomes of a particular strategy lie. The second part, which is again an aspect which is unique to equity markets, is the interconnectedness or what is called as complexity of different variables. When you're rolling a dice, the second roll may not depend on what you rolled in the first roll that you had. In equity markets and in financial markets, you will find that things are interconnected. Most of the time, the excesses in the bull market lead to the fall in the markets, which is it creates a bear market going forward. A behavior of say certain participants lead to influence on the other participants. So there is an interconnectedness between fundamentals, people's perceptions about things, and also about the outcomes. So Ultimately, this interconnectedness leads to complexity. So again, it's very difficult that you run an iteration and you get the exact number at the end of it. The way to deal with this is to consider probability. So you're not dealing with certainty, you're dealing with probability. And you have to work with what works most of the time. So your strategies have to be something that works 60 or 70% of the time, rather than expecting them to work 100% of the time. Peter Lynch, in his book, he said, in this business, if you're right 6 out of 10 times, you're doing good. You will never be 9 out of 10 times right. Even when you read George Soros, he says it's not how many times you were right or wrong, it's how much money you made when you were right and how much money you lost when you were wrong. Charlie Munger, in one of the Berkshire annual meetings, he had mentioned that if you remove top 15 of our bets, our performance is quite average. So it is possible to work with a good process which has good probability of delivering results, and sticking to that with discipline to get good long-term outcomes. So yes, there will be phases where a particular strategy will not work. But if it is working 7 out of 10 times or 70% of the times, I think it's a good strategy. You will have to bear as an investor those 30% of the times. And sometimes it can be a longer period also. In a 10-year period, something may not work 3 years. And if it comes once in a row, all the 3 years, it becomes emotionally very difficult to hold on to your strategy. But this is why people say that investing is quite simple, but it is not easy, because it takes that emotional strength, that discipline to stick to a strategy which has shown you a good track record of performance.
So, Nish, the other extension of the same question is that so now we've understood that okay, that all long-term performance will most likely have a phase of short-term underperformance. Now, let's say a particular there are particularly 10 funds which are underperforming the benchmark by 5%, argument's sake, over a 2-year or a 3-year period. Now, all 10 funds looked at from a pure lens of underperformance, everybody is underperforming. But eventually the process might be completely different for these 10 different ones. Somebody might not have a great process, somebody might have a good process. So as an investor, how do I differentiate which underperformance is despite a good process vis-a-vis which underperformance is something which is coming out of a bad process? So let's take the specific case of Can Robeco. Let's say in future, some of your funds underperform for whatever be the reason. As an investor, how should they check saying that, hey, this underperformance is a part of the natural cycle of that particular style, vis-a-vis, hey, this is an underperformance because something is going wrong in terms. So how does somebody differentiate this? Because nowadays everybody says I have a process. There's no fund manager who says that I don't have a process. So as an investor, how do we differentiate what is a good process if we can't measure it only via the outcome? How does somebody measure the process?
So again, very interesting, and you are right. That's the opposite of the corollary to how do you determine whether it's a good process or why a person or a fund is underperforming. So we can broadly split it into 2 areas, and so let me also make a comment that most of the investors look at outcomes and they chase performance. And what happens is many of the funds or investments which show a spurt of say a year or 3 years in a row, people tend to take that as the best strategy or best process followed. And hence you will see in the last 2 decades especially, you have seen themes or ideas populated over a 2-year or a 3-year period where they have worked and then they have gone away. So there are a lot of fads that have come and gone in equity markets across the world. So first, when we have to analyze a strategy, whether it's working or no, you have to look at longer term. So a few years of good performance doesn't make a good strategy. You will need to see how it has performed over a longer period of time, maybe a couple of decades or so. 2, what is the rationale behind that strategy? Is there something that really works? I mean, some people may have a strategy that I'll buy on Mondays and sell on Fridays. Okay, does that strategy work over a longer term, and what is the rationale behind that strategy? So it is important to have a strong foundation for the strategy that is being followed, and there has to be some outcomes that are seen by that strategy doing well. So, for example, investors follow companies with high ROC generally typically give good results. Has there been a back test done to really come to that idea or number? Value works over a longer time. Has there been any idea that or study done that reveals that yes, this is the case? So strategies that are formed maybe through interactions with the fund manager, maybe from the communication that you see from the funds. It is important to determine whether it's the right strategy with the right rationale to follow. The strategies, as I said, can have a downturn, so you have to bear with that. Now, the other part where and another very important candidate or aspect that one has to look at is discipline. While on paper, people may have good strategies put up on presentation slides, but is it followed with discipline? Most of the time you see, because of emotional pressure, because of performance pressures, people actually change their style, and typically that happens at the wrong time. You've seen 2 years of underperformance or 1 year of underperformance, and then you can't bear it anymore, and then you change strategy. Unfortunately, then you get into something that has worked for the last few years, and so you're riding at the top of that style cycle, and you will probably face downturn later on. So style changes is another thing. There are many parameters that people dilute. Typically during bull markets, people dilute their corporate governance parameters. They would buy anything that looks good or has a good story behind it. So one has to see whether a strategy or a style or an investment philosophy has been followed with discipline. If it has not, and that has led to underperformance, then there is something, a problem to be seen. So you need to see whether the path is right, and the second is whether the investor has walked the talk and not changed style in between. There was a study done by O'Shaughnessy, and he published it in a book called Invest Like the Best. This was, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s, I think, where he had actually made clones or clone portfolios of certain fund managers during that time, some 7 big fund managers during that time. He took their investment strategy and made a clone exactly based on their investment strategies. When after some time, when he evaluated the performance of the clones versus the fund managers, all the clones had done better than the fund managers that they were taken from. Possibly that shows that over a period of time, certain emotional pressures, performance pressures, get people to leave that discipline and change their style. And so while they probably feel good for a short term, in the long term, then you don't get the benefit of that style when it starts delivering you good results. So maybe analysis of a fund needs to be done in terms of what is the strategy or philosophy, and second, whether it has been followed with the discipline. Does the portfolio reflect the values and the ideas that were spoken about in the style?
Sure. So, the other question is that now we have a very strange scenario where global investors are kind of going gung-ho over India, and you see that the inflows are very, very strong from foreign investors. But at the same time, Indian investors seem to be selling out of Indian equity, which is getting reflected in the MF flows and also the DIA flows. So let's say from a behavioral lens, what is happening? What is it that they are seeing, and what is it that we are seeing, and why is there such a huge disconnect? Because that is also an extreme in terms of one of the highest buying ever. And again, this is also an extreme because the kind of selling is also very extreme. So why is there completely 2 different extreme reactions to the same fundamentals and the same reality which is in front of us?
Well, they both have very different objectives and goals. I have seen such kind of divergences many a times in my career, where one is selling and the other is buying. Global flows into India, a lot of them are allocation flows. So where they are not India dedicated funds, but India is part of a broader set of countries that they allocate, whether it is a basket of emerging markets or Asian markets, or maybe certain themes where India qualifies as a important part in the basket. So a majority of the funds that come into India are these allocation funds, and when they turn positive towards that entire basket, maybe India gets more funds coming in. Also, over in terms of the macro parameters that India has longer term, in terms of demographics, in terms of business qualities, in terms of ROEs of companies, in terms of growth rate, India does qualify in all these buckets. And that's why during times when people become positive on emerging markets, typically India gets good flows. On the other side, so the Indian retail investors, I see SIPs continuing in a good manner. So I'm happy that there are investors who continue with their discipline of coming with SIPs. There have been bulk redemptions in certain areas with certain funds that has led to certain negative figure. But on the other hand, I also see a lot of new retail accounts opening, new investors coming into the market, like probably what we hear in the US in terms of Robinhood investors. In India too, we are seeing a huge number of new broking accounts being opened, IPOs being oversubscribed by a good margin. People actually doing a lot of intraday trades. So retail volumes as a percentage seem to be going up in the last few months, especially from June onwards. We are seeing a good participation directly in the market from retail investors. Now, this is something also to worry about. For example, one of the broking companies told me that the new accounts that are opening have an average age of 31. And these people would be trading intraday, they would be trading quite frequently, they would be leveraging on their delivery trades or so. Some of that, something which has to, is a bit of worrying sign, where people are overconfident, they trade more. And typically in bull markets, new investors are sucked in with certain expectations that they will get the same returns that the market has generated, say from the bottom of March or so. So those expectations are wrong. There is overconfidence in trading. I think that leads to problems. I would suggest investors booking profit is not wrong, but investors being a little careless in their investment, that's where the risk comes in.
Sure. Also, Nimesh, at some point in time, all investors will have to go through a phase of bull market and probably a bubble phase and also a bear market phase. Now, this year has given us a taste of a sharp bear market and a sharp recovery. But just for somebody to be a little more prepared in terms of what's coming up in the future, what are the biases or probably behavioral traps that people should be aware of when looking at a bull market? Let's say at some point in future, we will all eventually go through a bull market, and that may or may not get converted into a bubble phase. But how does somebody prepare for a bull market followed by a bubble market? And do you think it's possible to identify a bubble phase much ahead in advance? And so how should somebody think through this and prepare much ahead in advance?
So in 2013, the Nobel Prize was shared between Eugene Fama, who was a strong advocate of of efficient market hypothesis, and Robert Shiller, who was actually towards behavioral finance. And that was strange. And I heard Robert Shiller saying that throughout the roadshows, which they had to do together after winning the Nobel Prize, throughout the interviews, Fama had only one strong argument saying that, while behavioral finance says there are bubbles, it cannot identify the starting of a bubble or the end of a bubble. Okay, and which is right. And Richard Thaler also, in one of his comments, he said that he and Eugene are good friend, and they said that they agree on the facts, they disagree on the opinions they have about those facts, why they happen, so the reasons behind them. It is difficult to say bubble is starting to form and this is where it will end, and because much of it is because of a kind of an interaction between people's perceptions, the narratives, and the fundamentals, how they play out. So it kind of moves in a cycle. there is a point where expectations become very high and the reality is not that good. And at that time, it starts reverting. So that's where the bubble bursts, when the expectation becomes so high and people realize that the emperor has no clothes. And then you see the downfall happening. The same way happens during depressions or troughs in the market, where people are so negative, but the reality is not that bad. And at some point of time, there is a realization that things are not that bad, and people start investing. So it's very difficult to exactly time these cycles, but there are markers that you can go with. Typically, an investor needs to follow the investment process and the asset allocation in the right way, which is pre-designed. And typically, investors should design all these things in a cold state. If you're designing it in a hurry, that okay, I just want to participate in the market, so let me make an investment strategy that allows me to buy as much as I want. That's also wrong. So in a cold state, in a rational state, make a investment plan and stick to it. One needs to worry about a few things in the bull markets. And the most important of all these items is overconfidence. Charlie Munger had, again, one of his favorite quotes was that during a downpour on a lake, there's a duck on the lake and there's a downpour, the water level goes up and the duck starts feeling that it has moved up in life. Okay, so it credits itself for the move up. Typically during these markets, because people are making a lot of money, they become a little careless. They trade more, they leverage more. That shows overconfidence. Also, they dilute their investment criteria for investing. So earlier they would be very stringent about what investments they are making. Now, to participate in the bull market, because they see everybody else making money, they want to dilute their investment criteria and try to just participate with the others. So that's another thing. This is how weeds come into your garden, and ultimately you will realize during corrections or downfalls that you have made some bad investments purely because things were going extremely well during a particular phase. Another behavioral concept that comes into play is the house money effect. Typically, this is seen in gamblers, that when they go for playing in a casino, they go, say, with $100 or 100 rupees. The way they bet that 100 rupees is very different from how they would bet the profit of 100 rupees. So suppose they make another 100 as a profit, they'll keep the money separate in their mental account. So one will be in one pocket of my principal, and the second will be the house money, which is like, I won from the casino. So that money, the risk money, the profit is taken as risk money, and which is taken in higher risk bets. So as people make profits, they try their hand in assets or categories that they don't have full knowledge about, and they take higher risk accordingly. So that needs to be taken care of. Now, somebody would say, why not take high risk with the profits? Even if it is gone, it is fine. This is the problem with gamblers. Then what happens is, over a longer term, you are never able to break out of this zone where you have a X wealth. You won't be able to go to the next level if you keep taking higher risk with your profits, because then you will not be able to accumulate or compound your money. You will have these spurts of making money and then losing them. Another impact that comes during these times is disposition effect, which is, I think, given by Terence O'Dean. He spoke about it, that people try to sell their winners very quickly, and whatever they are negative in, they try to hold on, that hoping that they would come to break even. They don't understand, or they don't want to understand something negative happened in the company, so they want to hold on to their losers, sell off their winners very quickly. So these are some of the things that you need to be careful of. Have a long-term view, avoid the noise as much as possible. Typically, if you take a long-term view, you will find that during these markets, people are very depressed, and they don't look at companies that are not in the news, or they are going through certain down cycle in their businesses. Those become opportunities to actually invest in, to prepare for the next wave, rather than chasing a glamour stock, a hot stock at absurd valuations.
Sure. So, Nimesh, on similar lines, how does somebody prepare for a bear market? Now, this year, obviously, you have seen a very sharp crash. and thankfully it didn't last for a long time. But history tells us that bear markets can go for fairly longer stretches of time. So how does somebody mentally prepare themselves? Because you also mentioned that catching a bubble is not easy. Obviously, in retrospect, it's always easy that you could say, hey, you should have looked at ABC parameters, but these parameters obviously keep changing for each and every bubble. So net, assuming that somebody won't be able to precisely time a bubble and they will inevitably have to take part in some crash in the future. So how does somebody go about preparing as to how should somebody handle a bear market?
So there, I have seen two approaches when people prepare for a bear market or a downfall. Uh, One is the so this is experiences of the 99-2000 kind of boom. Uh, One approach is the Warren Buffett approach, which says that I stick to my investment discipline. If I don't find value, I will not invest. I would rather sit on cash for some time till the market gives an opportunity. And every few years, the market gives an opportunity. Whether it is company specific or market wide is different, but there is an opportunity. You would invest during that time. And so actually you take some profits off as you're going into the up move. Again, that depends on the investment strategy and the process that one follows. The second approach is what was taken by George Soros during that time. George Soros, he was negative about dot-com stocks in the beginning of 99, and he had written about it in his newsletters. But a few months down the line, he changed his approach. He said, no, maybe I was wrong. Things can actually go much further than what is seen right now. So actually, he took advantage of the herd or the momentum that was in the market, and I think he exited somewhere around in the beginning of 2000 or so. So some people who have momentum strategies or have a way of investing, which actually gets them to invest during these upturns and give them a signal or a stop loss to exit at the right time, they can do that. One of the things that I recommend is have within your process, have what is called a rose in a vineyard, where if you see any vineyards that you've been to, you will find that among the vines, there is actually a rose plant kept at the beginning of that farm, that vineyard. And you will find there are certain bacteria or viruses that affect these vines. The same affects the rose plant, but they affect the rose early. So that wilting of that rose gives you an idea that things are getting worse on the other side. Whenever within your process you find that certain incoming data about the companies, about the economy, about the funds are coming in negative or worse than what was expected, that's the time to actually be alert. That's your canary in the cave mind. That's when you start preparing that in case there's a downturn, how do I handle it? The other problem that many of the investors have is, again, I said weeds in the garden, where somehow you will be stuck in your portfolio with bad investments because they were high beta, they performed well during the bull market, quality of decision making was diluted, and then you end up with bad investments during a downturn. They will pain the most. That time, I think instead of having a regret aversion or a loss aversion, you need to have a stop loss, or you need to evaluate as rationally as possible and take decisions, at least switch decisions at that time. At the bottom of the bear market, what happens is people become what is called myopic loss averse, where actually there is an opportunity and your investment process is telling you that buy these companies, these are, or make these investments right now, allocate money. But typically, people are very eager to invest when market is up, and they are not at all interested in the market when the market is down. So they are doing exactly opposite of what they should be doing. So in a down market, like what happened in March to May, people were not able to invest because of fear that goes around at that time. People think of low probability outcomes as like, significant outcomes to worry about. So that's fear, right? When you think that anything bad can happen, even if on paper it looks like a very low probability. Two, loss aversion for a short term, which is called myopic loss aversion. You buy a company at 100 or make an investment at 100. You don't want to see it going down to 90 also, because even if on a long term you see the target price is 200, You don't want to see it going 90 even in the short term. Markets don't know the cost price of your investment, so they won't stop or turn around the moment you start investing. But it is important that whenever the time is right to invest, in a staggered way, at least start investing. During 2008, investors like Howard Marks, so experienced over the years to time the market or be sure about the markets. Investors like Howard Marks were also staggering their investment through that period of time. But they did invest. Ultimately, what matters is that you are able to invest during those downturns, have a long-term view. The whole stock market cycle looks very interesting when you take a decade or a 2-decade view. Suddenly, you will look forward to a bear market, or suddenly you look forward to a correction, because that gives you time to invest your money in the right manner. And then the outcomes are uncertain, but there's no risk there. At the bottom, you may have uncertainty, but you will not have risk. And that's what leads to wealth creation.
Sure. Nimesh, you also have a very interesting thing called Captain's Log in Can Robeco Mutual Fund. Could you also give us a sense of what's the thought process, and basically what's the Captain's Log, and how does it work?
So Captain's Log is actually our investment journal that we maintain. This is something I recommend to every investor. In fact, every advisor also, as to whatever decisions are taken, you need to write down a few lines at the time that decision is taken. Today, so for our fund managers, what we do is whenever they invest, they write a few lines about why they are making that investment on that day at that particular price. It can be any reason. They may be switching from one company to another, or maybe buying fresh or selling something where booking profits, whatever. But write down a few lines about why you're doing so. This helps in improving decisions. At the end of the year or end of the review period, just looking at numbers will not make sense. Yes, you will pat yourself on the good decisions taken because you made some good money. You will kick yourself for the bad decision. Frankly, most of the people blame something else when they see when something doesn't work. But writing it down will tell you whether it was luck or skill, whether during the investment journey, during this period of time that one was invested, was there any opportunity to change that call? Because an argument for which a company was bought or sold, that changed in some time. And whether it's not wrong to change your decision based on incoming facts. It's wrong when you change your decision, but you did nothing about it. The action was not there. Like, you just thought about changing, but you didn't do it. So it is better to keep a log so that you can track your investment decision. What has worked, what has not worked. If you find a mistake that you're doing consistently, put it into your investment checklist so that you don't repeat it. To err is human, but to repeat it would be stupid. So it's better to learn from the investing lessons that the outcomes have given you, and then put it back into your checklist. So we call it the Captain's Log because I'm a Star Trek fan, and I used to see it on Doordarshan when I was a kid. And Captain Kirk used to start every episode by writing an investment journal or his log saying that Captain's Log, star date so and so, some Klingon warship is coming and we are taking this decision to attack them or something. So he used to write that, he used to record all the decisions that were taken, which can be later evaluated. I think this is the way Daniel Kahneman says that this is the best way to improve your decision making. So he says, if you want to improve your decisions, go to the nearest store and buy a notebook and just write down why you're taking certain decisions, and do it in an unbiased manner.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nimesh. I mean, that was like, we obviously I learned a lot from you, and I'm sure like all of our viewers would have a lot of takeaways from this. So thank you so much once again, Nimesh, for all the insights and your time.
As usual, it's great talking to you, Arun, and thanks for the insightful questions and the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks.